We are living in an era of conservative leadership, nationalistic and fundamentalist movements, and changing social conventions, electing leaders who favour business expansion rather than regulation. The rich enjoy apparently unlimited prosperity, while fear of radicals and foreigners combine to almost completely close off our nation to immigration and contribute to the resurgence of hate groups. Religious fundamentalism is reviving as new moral and social attitudes come into vogue. Additionally, the first radio broadcasts and motion pictures are expanding our access to news and entertainment. That whole introduction was written of the 1920s, looking back over the decade at what had shaped it most fundamentally. Until I got to the part about radio, I suspect a few of you thought that I was offering an incisive analysis of the current world political climate. It was into this environment in 1925 that Pope Pius XI instituted the Feast of Christ the King, the feast that we celebrate today, in response to the nationalism and the secularism that he perceived were rising across the globe. He offered this feast as an antidote. Given its full name, it's called the King of the Universe, which has always sounded quite attractive to me. Whilst political leaders are squabbling over this world, the Pope sought to teach them that when it came to the bigger picture, Jesus was Lord over all. And if we can see parallels in the world to those opening sentences, then perhaps we need the festival as much today as they did then, to be reminded of what godly leadership and godly kings look like. And there are a few noticeable differences. We're used to a democracy, and I'm glad that that's how our nation runs. But it's not how God's kingdom runs. Due process and the majority vote can and do err. We've not elected God Prime Minister, and God's creation is not made up of registered voters. There are no referendums on God's will, and there is no chance of a recount. Now, you might be thinking that history has taught us what happens when you give one king or one person the kind of power that I've just described. It tends, and you'd be quite right, to be tyrannical and bloody. But Jesus knew the oppressive nature of secular kings, and in contrast to them, he connected his role as king to humble service. And he commanded his followers, his disciples, and those of us who bear his name today as Christians, to follow in his footsteps in that regard, to be servants as well. When we celebrate Christ the King, we're not celebrating an oppressive ruler, but one willing to die for humanity and whose loving kindness endures forever. Christ is the King that gives us true freedom, freedom in him. And this reappropriating of kingship is nowhere better seen than in the relationship between Jesus and Pilate. And we caught just a snippet today of that, which is a much larger and lengthier dialogue. Pilate, on the one hand, uses his power and authority for selfish ends, with no concern for the building of community, and certainly not for a community guided by love and by truth. Pilate hoards power to himself, and he lords it over the people, even to the point of destroying them on a cross or otherwise. Jesus empowers others. He uses his authority to wash the feet of his disciples. He spends his life on them, every last part of it, and he gives his life to bring life. Pilate's rule brings terror, even in the midst of calm. where we see that Jesus' rule brings peace, even in the midst of terror. Think of the disciples on that boat in the midst of the storm. Pilate's followers imitate him by using violence to conquer and divide people. Jesus' followers put away the sword in order to invite and unify people, as Jesus does by giving us that example of being lifted up upon the cross to draw all people to himself. Pilate's authority originates from the will of Caesar, and therefore it is always tenuous. As mighty as Caesar might have seemed one day, his power failed, and the whole of that civilization crashed to the ground. Jesus' authority originates from doing the will of God and is eternal. In so doing, Jesus radically redefines and transforms the concept of kingship. He reveals a different type of king, all-powerful, yes, but also all-loving, all-merciful, and in relationship with his creatures through his church. We are called to submit to Jesus as our king, but it's a submission that brings not oppression, but rather liberation and freedom. What we mustn't do is to think of Jesus as sometimes king and sometimes our brother and servant, as if the two were distinct from one another, like an actor in an amateur play who's short on cast plays both the innkeeper and the second shepherd. It's not like that. That is the temptation, because for us, kings mean one thing and servants mean another. Kings don't willingly submit to torture and execution, and servants don't rule kingdoms. But Jesus is not meant to be an example to us of multiple personalities. He's not even to be understood as sometimes occupying one role and sometimes another. Rather, he reveals true kingship and true service, united in his one person at all times. They're not masks that he takes on and takes off and puts on to suit the occasion and the moment, but rather he is fundamentally both king and servant. And so on this day, when we praise Jesus as king, here is something to soothe those of you who are opening the paper or turning on the evening news in a rage. And those of you who are bothered to open the paper at all anymore. And it's this: the rulers of this earth will pass away, but not so Jesus' rule. You may find this hard to believe, but one day Brexit will be consigned to the history books, and one day, even further in the future, the last person who remembers anything about it at all will forget, and it will be lost to humanity altogether. But thanks be to God, Christ and his kingdom will endure. Amen.